We constantly see the pictures of Africa's debt as a whole being on the rise since 2000 and even 2010. If you switch that to look at debt as a percentage of GDP and go a bit further, you will see that there was a huge peak in debt levels as a percentage of GDP in the 80s and 90s. But now, in terms of economic size, the majority of debt levels are back to the late 1970s in terms of exposure. And that the reason I say this is because we need to remember that effectively what we are in is back to normal. And before COVID-19, there should have been significant room for growth that was much needed, for example, to meet infrastructure needs. We all know those numbers, the numbers which are in terms of infrastructure financing required for external support. But it brings me to one similarity and one big difference between the late 1970s and now, and this is where I'm going to bring China in. The similarity is this. So both now and in the 1970s, economies did experience a big worldwide external shock. In the 1970s, it was the oil crisis, and now we're having COVID-19 and the various measures that we're having to deal with along the health crisis. But here's the difference between now and the 1970s. The composition of debt. There is a much broader range of creditors now in comparison to the 1970s, and in particular private sector, which our colleague from UNECA has been discussing, and China. And across the continent, we should also remember, and our dear moderator shared this with us, that the amounts from China and the impact of the amounts from China really differ widely. Look at Cabo Verde. 2% of total bilateral debt is owed to China. Then you go to Angola, yes, with natural resources, we can discuss whether that's a good or a bad thing, has 80% of its bilateral debt to China. Even Zambia, who we think has a lot of debt from China, multilateral finance is about the same amount of China as China, private sector just about the same amount as China. So their composition really, really differs depending on the country's ability to borrow and China's openness as well to new models and different risk analysis than others do. And again, I will come back to this shortly. And that's the reason why China and the private sector are big creditors is not just because of them. It's also because bilateral donors have reduced their overall spending, especially in comparison to the GDP of African countries and borrowing countries. And they also have consolidated their finance to focus on specific countries. And then you also have, in terms of the private sector, you have low credit ratings, which do restrict access to private sector finance for many countries. So China is effectively filling a gap in many countries. And we have this idea that the World Bank is, all the multilateral development banks, provide finance for infrastructure. Well, on our continent, it's really the African Development Bank, which has fulfilled that role most importantly since the 2000s. The World Bank hasn't financed, for example, a newly built rail project since 2002. So in terms of meeting those infrastructure deficits, we are having to look at other partners. This is absolutely key. And we cannot distinguish China's role from that gap that China is filling in a multilateral system, which has not been meeting our needs for a very long time and of no reason in terms of our creation. So how can we improve the relationship with China? How can African countries get a better financing relationship with China going forward? I have three particular proposals from the analysis that my colleagues have done. First of all, we need to focus on the quality of debt, not the quantity. There is far too much a focus on the quantity. We need to look at the quality. How productive are the different loans from all lenders for our economies? How much, for example, are they supporting women as a key question? How can civil society drive higher quality through demanding transparency and using information which is already available? And definitely a starting point will be agreeing on what civil society sees as high quality. Is it recurrent expenditure? Is it recurrent expenditure? And how does that link to social spending? Is it expenditure on infrastructure? Which of these are best? We really need a very strong focus on that quality question, and that will also support our negotiations and work with China going forwards. Second of all, we need to question the aspects of the international system which are not meeting African needs. We've already talked a little bit about the SDRs, too few going to African economies. My firm was the first to point that out. But where, for example, does this 60% debt to GDP threshold come from that we always use in terms of determining debt sustainability? And that is also used by private credit ratings agencies, which again, we were talking about earlier. Where does the evidence for this 60% come from? Is it based on African economies? Is it based on growing economies? That it's not like we have looked into it, and it isn't. I'll say that's a quick disclaimer. It's not based on our economies. So let's not forget that the entirety of African debt is also very small in comparison to the rest of the world. It's equivalent to debt of an emerging economy. So how can this really be creating a crisis for any creditor? So I think we have to really focus on reforming the system. We need to look into these outcomes and really understand so that the system is actually working for African countries, so that we're not overly reliant, for example, on a creditor like China, which doesn't use these types of risk analysis, uses a completely different way, so that we can spread our own risk as borrowers and into different types of financing available, which can really help our economies. And then third proposal, last but not least, is that we do need to avoid what happened in the 80s and 90s. There is already a discussion about avoiding structural adjustment-like policies through new loans, which I think there'll be further discussion of that, which is great, really important that that is done. But that is not the only issue. Obviously, there is also a discussion about, for example, when it comes to China, the new suggestion, the kind of new focus is perhaps private investment from China can be the new focus rather than concessional loans. Well, private investment also comes with its challenges and goes towards some of the challenges that we faced with structural adjustment. So we need to be very, very careful about those arguments. I would also say the idea that countries, the other aspect in terms of avoiding what happened in the 80s and 90s, and again, it's been brought up a bit earlier, is the idea that countries must sit individually with all their creditors, putting pressure on them. This kind of debt restructuring framework is also highly problematic. There is no evidence, for example, that China has not given debt relief. A country like Zambia had more debt relief from China during the HIPC process than it did from individual countries like UK or US. So that's not a reason to just, be focusing on why China needs to be in the same room as all the other creditors. The key issue is, how do we have more coordination across borrowers alongside more accountability to citizens? How can the borrowers learn from each other to get better outcomes from their creditors? And again, this is the role of the African Union. How can the African Union convene those types of discussions? How can countries even pool their risk, pool their assets to get even more finance, like the Grameen Bank did for countries that couldn't get access to finance? These are things that China itself has also done, pooling finance from different provinces, trying to find new ways of getting access to finance. What role can African organizations like the African Monetary Fund, those protocols are there, what role can that play? How can the momentum around regional integration be garnered to make these happen? And again, just strengthen our basis as a negotiating bloc with our creditors, including China. So that's my key message. This is not just about China, whatever it is. We definitely need to include China in our analysis, understand Chinese loans through transparency, etc. But building forward together is really about trying to build a better multilateral system to meet our needs. We build forward that way, and we certainly shouldn't be building backwards.
Thank you, Ms. Ryder, for that. We have 1 minute left, and I know that we have other sessions that are starting in a few minutes, but as we wind up, I'd like to hear some closing remarks from our speakers. So I'd like to start with you, Ms. Ryder, first. What's the one message that you would like us to take home in this discussion as we're talking about forging and moving forward together?
I think I'll pick my first one. Focus on quality, not quantity. And use that as a starting point. I think we can start with that one.
To read and sign the Harare Declaration, go to www.afrodat.org/initiatives. Click on Afrodat Conference on Debt and Development, and then read more. And finally, the outcome statement.